that grinding it out as you look to break into the industry is sort of the secret sauce that separates somebody who's a true professional who can really deliver results for a studio and somebody who just would love to be a game developer. I struggled very hard to break into the industry. I started making games in 2000. I got my first gig in 2005, so that's a 5-year arc of me trying to break in. In 2004, I moved to Austin, Texas, where there was an industry. Not a big one at the time, but there was one there, and eventually I did get in by just being present in that space. So I do think today, despite all the remote work, there is something to be said for being present in San Francisco and Los Angeles, Seattle. It does go a long way. And there is a bit of this underlying idea that like you're not serious about working here unless you already live here. If you're not in LA, if you're not in San Francisco, you must not be a serious candidate.
I feel like that's super antiquated now with remote work.
There are definitely people who do better in person.
Yeah.
And for them, I hope there will continue to be game studios that they can go to. My experience, though, making games remote is that we get a lot more done. Both Mobilityware, and they're an awesome company, don't get me wrong, they're phenomenal. But they are an in-person studio, and that's just a choice they've made about we are looking for the kinds of people who want that. And I think that's a good choice. I do think that the reliance on remote work.
Hey y'all, that's a mistake. He's definitely talking about in-person work, so the following statement is about working in person.
It really stems from a lack of good process, a lack of good production. If we screw up, at least we'll be in person and we can have a conversation about it, and I can always walk by and see you. And presentism still persists, and especially in AAA, because that's how they've always made games. They don't know another way to do it. The immense cost of these campuses, it's very wasteful. But there is this like idea that we get more work out of people by trapping them in this like this campus with all these toys and culture, and the reality is that very little work gets done as compared to being at home. And if people are not working at home, then you've hired the wrong people, or you've managed them wrong, you give them the wrong incentives. But I think like that same mindset of presentism persists when it comes to job applicants. They don't take you seriously unless you're present. Like on one hand, they're paying the immense rents and property taxes and all the expense of living on the West Coast, and so it's kind of like shared misery, like we're in this together. But yeah, if there's a candidate pool of like 1,000 people applying to a job, they may, just to make it easier on themselves, just take a razor to anyone who's not already there. And the danger that, of course, is that you advantage the people who can afford to live there, the people who look like the other people at your studio, and you sort of perpetuate this. And you have a bunch of people who come from the same place, who have the same life experiences, and it makes it really hard to make new games. There's exceptions, but really, like, there's plenty of opportunity. Just keep working at it. Keep being present in the industry, and it does tend to work out eventually. It doesn't have to be a major industry city. You can find, like I found Austin, and in the early 2000s, it was probably about the size of like a DC or Boston scene. It wasn't, there was some stuff, there was some legacy of Origin systems there with Ultima and Wing Commander, but it wasn't massive, and they were generally just hiring each other, the same people they'd always worked with. It was actually quite difficult to get any leverage in that ecosystem at the time. I think it's different today, but nothing is more attractive to somebody in video games than somebody who can just contribute. And the best way to do that is just to make stuff, game jams, local indie stuff. Don't bite off too much. You actually want to ship it and finish it, but then you do the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and you keep getting better. Your portfolio keeps going up. If I were trying to break in right now, I would go hard on UEFN. I would mention that I'm obviously biased. Look North World is a publisher on UGC platforms, and we're big on UEFN, but we will be on 2 to 3 more platforms by the end of the year. That said, building something in UEFN, not only are you learning the future of Unreal, like Verse is the future of Unreal, that editor is the future of Unreal, you can ship stuff and make money very quickly. You can take a template for a Box Wars map or Zone Wars map, and then mod it a little bit and release it as your own.
Yeah.
And see what happens, and then you do the next one. I think I like to, like, when I'm learning something new, I like to take, rather than make a game, I'm going to make a prototype that does this. And this is what that full polished prototype looks like. And then make it as small as possible. And I go, oh, I learned a bunch. Now I'm going to make the next one and the next one. And there's really no excuse today with the tools that exist to not be making stuff if you want to be a game developer. Just go make stuff and find the shortest path to making stuff. It doesn't need to be your dream game. It doesn't need to be like the biggest ambition. Make small, focused stuff, ship it, and do the next thing, and do it repeatedly until you get better and the market turns around. Like when I was in Chicago, this group of folks who were at DePaul University worked on this senior project in which you played an octopus pretending to be a dad. And then they were like, we should keep working on this. And they all had part-time gigs. They were like working part-time, and then they would get together and work on Octodad. It took them a while because Octodad, for many of them, wasn't their full-time gig. I remember meeting Phil, who's the CEO of Young Horses, who made Octodad during that spell, like before Octodad came out. And they're like, yeah, so-and-so's still like working at a local restaurant. And like they had like hourly gigs like actors do in Hollywood when they're trying to make it. Octodad came out and did really well. They landed the Bugsnax deal. Like they made their own path. It didn't matter that whether there was industry work or not for them. They just picked a project, and they didn't predict their success. They just knew they loved Octodad and wanted to make it a thing.
I talk with a lot of students about what the day-to-day looks like in between you and your AAA studio job, where it's like, okay, but what happens in the 5 years between your graduation and the studio job? And it's usually the part-time work and the creative thing on the side.
Yeah, I do think I don't know if the 10,000 hours thing is real. You know, the whole Beatles putting in 10,000, like they worked in the nightclub. They did like a residency for years, the Beatles. Mm-hmm. And they thought it was like they accrued 10,000 hours as a band playing in these clubs as like the house band before they got their deal, before they became the Beatles. And they would not have been the Beatles had it not been for that. I do think there's some very challenging truth to that. Like that grinding it out as you look to break into the industry is sort of the secret sauce that separates somebody who's a true professional who can really deliver results for a studio and somebody who just would love to be a game developer. And when you have kids, it's a different equation. So really think about as you plan out, as much as you can, as you plan out your family growth and your commitments outside of work, there are real trade-offs. And you have any career, but especially a demanding career, one that's is emotionally involved as a creative career, there will be moments where you're not good enough for anybody. You're not good enough for your partner or your kids or your work, and you just hope that they all have enough grace to go through that period with you. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes you get fired. Sometimes it creates marital, like there's a lot of divorces that I've seen happen in the industry. Sometimes the kids' relationship is not good. Now I have a great relationship with my spouse. We're 21 years in, going strong. It's never been better. Love my wife. Awesome. My kids and I are super close now. So my story worked out. It doesn't always work out. And so as you add people in your life, know that there will be choices where you will have to decide between, especially in a creative career, that your art and the people in your life. Have those conversations up front as much as you can with the people in your life. Your kids are just your kids. Like they have to come first. Yeah. And if you don't want to grow up and regret it. I'm a very present father. I have a 17-year-old and a 13-year-old, and they want to hang out with me all the time. So I didn't screw them up. They're resilient. They gave me grace, while I continue to learn more about myself. So I'm super fortunate.
So anyone trying to break in, I feel like just should have a baseline knowledge of business, the market.
That's a good point. A lot of people just want to focus on the art of the craft of making games. But if you understand the macroeconomics or the business environment of the industry you're going in, you're going to be able to better predict who's better to work for, what games are going to actually ship, what salaries make sense or are sustainable. And knowing it is power.
Yeah.
And if you want true negotiation power, if you really want the best for yourself, understanding the economics and how the industry works is very powerful. It doesn't mean you're sacrificing any ideals or whatever, but you do exist in a very capitalistic environment. You could argue there's significant downsides to it. There are some upsides, but ultimately just understand it. And you don't need to run a business. You don't have to become a business person. Just understand it's wisdom. From 2020 to 2022, the industry went crazy. The COVID boom, the industry was growing 20 to 30% a year. Companies were panicking and hiring as many people as they could just to keep up with that revenue growth. The salaries were out of control. The number of hirings were out of control. It was hard to hire anybody. So many of these people who are laid off now jumped ship from their last job in 2020, said, see ya, and they took a better paying job with better benefits and supposedly a better situation, only to find themselves out of work like a year later or 18 months later, because many of the companies they went to were poorly run. They were paying too much money with no revenue. They didn't really have a plan beyond their vertical slice to fund the game. They were just hoping we'd make a great vertical slice, we'll get another investment. That all dried up. So we're seeing a couple things happen. One is now we're in like a single digit year-over-year growth. It's still growing. The industry's doing fine. But the predicted growth, the curve, there's not going to be as big of a market in 2 or 3 years as they expected. And so they don't need as many games, or the games that they made, there's things like it that have come up that they've come out and they haven't done as well. Things like Assassin's Creed haven't done as well. Things like EA investing in Wild Hearts and Immortals of Avernum did not do well. Those tanked. And so people are panicking, they're reassessing, they're starting over, and they're going, let's just maintain our revenue. Let's not try to grow. And so anything that's risky, new, not going super well, looks like it's going to cost them a lot more, they're just cutting it. The other thing I would say is that a lot of these people went to these companies backed by these former Riot people, former Blizzard people, and there's nothing wrong with working there. Good on them. They've done amazing work. Should we all be so lucky to get our industry started there? The issue with that is that a great game maker is not necessarily a good business owner. And many of them didn't have a plan to actually ship their game. They just had a plan to get a vertical slice done. Or they had a plan to like barely get the game out and hopefully they have a hit. And then get more investment. Yeah. Absolutely. And so you never, ever, 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 ever want to take a game job where there's a cliff. You want to know that there's runway for this game and the one after, at least. If there's just a cliff in the middle of production or a cliff at the end of production, that's a red flag. If you care about stability, don't go work there. If you're trying to get in the industry right now, you do have an advantage if you have a demonstrable skill set because you are lower cost. You're not going to cost as much as somebody who's been at it for 10 to 15 years. The other thing that's happening is they're canceling a bunch of projects, and in a quarter, in 3 months, in 6 months, there's going to be a realization like, oh no, we don't have products in 2025. I believe we're going to start to see a ramp up of new product cycles that will create sort of an inverse situation where suddenly they need a lot more people. And it's insane that you would lay off thousands of people only to hire them back in 6 months. That is the reality of a shareholder, public-run organization when you are managing financials quarter to quarter, where you don't have a clear product strategy. You just need to like clean house and start over and reduce your spend while you're trying to figure out like what's next. And I would say after you have your first job, you work with those people, and then they go to other studios and they refer you to stuff, and then you go to a new studio and you meet some new people, and eventually your network gets so broad and so wide, you're never out of work. Yeah, so every 3 months I take my work address book and I export it and I import it into my personal email so that I accrue contact information constantly. My coworkers, I always get their cell phones and put in my phone well before we're laid off. You need cell phones. Cell phones are the best if you can get them. So when I see it like on a signature, I keep that cell phone. Film and music operate all on SMS, which is wonderful because they're like forever in your contacts, right? They're on like Google Contacts or whatever. We rely a lot on our work systems, and you shouldn't. Make sure you get SMS numbers for everyone you work with, every contact you meet. Don't just ask for their number, but anytime you get it, just in the course of regular business, like put that in your permanent contacts. We talked a lot about grinding out those years of trying to break into the video game industry. I will say 24 years in, I meet people with normal jobs and they don't want to talk about what they do. I meet people with normal jobs, they talk about it, and they're so apathetic and uninvested. And more importantly, because they're uninvested, their growth has stopped.
As a person?
As a person, because they learn their job, they're a master of it, and they have no more incentive to continue to grow as a person. And in video games, it never gets easy. It's always hard, and you are always mandated to learn, to grow, to improve. It is entertainment. I also think that there's a thing about people who are writers They're hyper aware of people, of feeling, because they're always looking for and fuel and inspiration and trying to like, how would somebody with this perspective see the world, and how would they interact with the world? Because I need to write that character. Same thing with game designers, like a door handle, a light. Like when you're making games, everything's interactable. So you're always thinking about like, how do you tutorialize it? How do you make it clear? How do you make it simple? How do you make it compelling and immersive? How does it feel? And that way of seeing the world starts to take over. It drives, if you have a partner in your life, it drives them crazy, because I have so many strong opinions about things, how it looks, how it feels, how it's laid out, but that's my whole life when I'm working, is I'm designing for those things. And I think that's normal with an artist or a writer, and to not have that lens on the world, to just do a job. I think there are people who just simply can't accept that reality as like their future. So it is really tough to break in, and it is a grind, and it is discouraging at time. But the flip side of that is that you get this incredible life-giving path when it starts to fall into place that really changes your whole relationship with the world. And the danger, of course, is that it eats you alive, and you crunch and you make sacrifices, because it's so compelling and so gripping to live in art and entertainment. So then the maturity is that like balancing the what's, your own well-being with your drive. I was actually pretty burnt out on making games pre-COVID, and I was wondering like, should I make a career change? Is this the right path? And then COVID happened, and then we were all at home playing Among Us, playing Animal Crossing, and games became this fundamental vehicle for easing the suffering of the world and connecting people. And I think more than ever understood the depth and power of gaming. It made me really hopeful for the world in a way, and I haven't lost it since. Like, I've been on fire for game making since. Obviously volunteering and starting an IGDA chapter and volunteering in middle schools and high schools, and I see it also as a vehicle for equity across social and gender lines. We have a long way to go in terms of representation, but I do think as things get more global and remote, and it's easier to build things on your own, it's opportunity for people who can learn to do it to become part of that ecosystem in a way without stakeholders or normal gatekeepers in the way. And I think Gen Z and Gen Alpha are going to take full advantage of that, and I can't wait. I'm very excited.
And we're done. If y'all have a question, leave a comment and we'll address it in a future video. All right, peace out.